Welcome back, everybody. Today we are going to talk about Saint Pope Paul VI, Humanae Vitae. This is an encyclical from 1968. I think it's safe to say this is the most controversial text in Catholicism since 1870, when the First Vatican Council proclaimed papal infallibility. Although, having said that, I would also say at the same time that Catholics today, a lot of them don't disagree with it as many Catholics did immediately after the text was promulgated, but they just ignore it. Now, if you look statistically speaking, that Catholics in this country anyways contracept statistically about the same as non-Catholics. And I think maybe in previous decades, Catholics wrestled with the questions. But these days, there's not much wrestling going on. There's a lot of Catholics just assume that the Church is wrong about this and don't even explore the question. So here we are in this third unit. We're talking about, again, some of the controversial issues in the Church. And so this teaching on birth control certainly is one of them. So it came out in 1968. Just think about the historical context at that time. Vatican II had just finished in 1965, 3 years earlier, and already this sort of chaos that would ensue in the 1970s and 80s into the 90s, and in some ways still to this day, was already going, right? So in other words, how to understand what Vatican II did or didn't do through the Catholic Church into chaos a bit. Other things, of course, too, that are relevant, the advent of the birth control pill around 1960. So birth control had been around, I mean, since the beginning of time in a sense, but sort of medical birth control through pills, the pill was new, and so there was this need to rethink or readdress the question. Sexual revolution, of course, related to that. Think of all the sort of late 1960s and into the 70s. And in many ways today we're still suffering from the question of the sexual revolution. And so that's just some of the basic context surrounding it. Also, another context is this question on birth control had been sort of unanimous among Christians, that they unanimously rejected it. Until 1930 at the Lambeth Conference, the Anglicans, what we in America call them the Episcopalians, said under certain circumstances, contraception is acceptable. Again, notice that 1930 is 30 years before the pill was invented, so they did not have the pill in mind, but and they did, and the Anglicans did not say across the board. They just said under certain circumstances, but of course that was quickly ignored. The idea of under certain circumstances. So it was first the Anglicans, and then the sort of dominoes start to fall. Other Protestant groups sort of joined the Anglicans in saying contraception is fine. So by the time you get to 1968, a lot of Christian groups for decades had been changing their teaching on this, and there was a lot of expectation that the Catholics would do the same thing. But through Humanae Vitae, the Church reaffirms its stance against birth control. So what we're going to do here is get into some of the key sections, the seed text, and I want to sort of expand on some of the points that Paul is making, and then at the end of the text, he does what I think is interesting. He makes some sort of predictions, right? Predictions of what would happen if we enter into what we call a contraceptive society, and of course we did. And we can ask, and in our discussions on Zoom, we should discuss, what do you think about Paul VI's predictions now that we, decades later, have to have the advantage of history, that we know what happened when this contraceptive society was ushered in. And the 4 points that Paul makes, the sort of worries that he had, did his worries come true, or was he just totally off the mark? So we'll talk about that at the end of this video, and then we'll discuss it in class, among other things here. All right, so let's just read some of this text and then expand on it a bit. So the first thing comes from section 8. And one of the things that I hope you noticed as you read this is that the question of contraception is not addressed right from the beginning of the text, right? That Paul rightly goes through a variety of issues. And we're going to start here with the idea of marriage. Where does marriage come from? One of the mistakes I think happen in our discourse about this topic and frankly any topic that we wrestle with is that we'll talk narrowly about that issue. So in this case, it's narrowly talk about contraception. But what Paul does correctly at the beginning of this text is he wants to locate that question of contraception into the larger framework of things like who are we as human beings, right? Created in the image and likeness of God. What does that mean? What does it mean? What does marriage mean? In other words, contraception has to do with between a married husband and wife. So what is marriage? Where does that come? The sexual act. What is the telos, the goal, the objective, the thing to which the sexual act tends towards? So understanding contraception within that larger framework only makes sense. We can only make sense of contraception within that larger framework. So we can't just talk about contraception. Contraception is one sort of piece of a larger puzzle, and if you want to understand that piece of the puzzle, you have to understand the puzzle as a whole. All right, so let's just read, again, we're starting on section 8 here, and this has to do with marriage taking its origin from God. Again, so he wants to first talk about marriage and then later situate contraception within that discussion of marriage. So he says, married love particularly reveals its true nature and nobility when we realize that it takes its origin from God, who is love, the Father from whom every family in heaven and earth is named. Marriage, then, is far from being the effect of chance or the result of the blind evolution of natural forces. It is in reality the wise and provident institution of God the Creator, whose purpose was to effect in man his loving design. As a consequence, husband and wife, through the mutual gift of themselves, which is specific and exclusive to them alone, develop that union of two persons in which they perfect one another, cooperating with God in the generation and rearing of new lives. The marriage of those who have been baptized is, in addition, invested with the dignity of a sacramental sign of grace, for it represents the union of Christ and his church. What is he getting at specifically at the beginning of that when he says married love reveals its true nature and nobility when we realize that it takes its origin from God, who is love, right? It's not simply that God ordains or commands marriage and procreation, though that's true. But Paul VI is making a deeper claim. From 1 John, we know that God is love. And if thinking back to our discussion on the Trinity, we talked about the three persons, God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Something that St. Augustine in the 5th century talked about is that if God is love, that means you need three things. You need the lover, the beloved, and the love between them, right? So the lover, the Father, the beloved, the Son, and the love between them, the Holy Spirit. And so if marriage takes its origin or finds its origin from God and God is love, then therefore marriage is a participation in the very life of God, because you have the husband, you have the wife, and then you have the love between them. So marriage, you know, in our culture today, people just talk about, oh, marriage is just a human institution. It's an antiquated human institution. It is, you know, oppressive and patriarchal and all of that. But right here from the beginning, Paul VI is giving us not just a different, but a beautiful description of what it is. It's not a human institution alone that comes out of some sort of cultural norms, and of course cultural norms shift. He's saying it's a participation in the life of God. And therefore, as it says at the end of the section, marriage is a sacrament. That is a visible sign of an invisible reality, because it is a visible sign of the invisible grace given by God through marriage. So notice here, Paul is drawing on topics we talked about earlier in this course, the Trinity, and then sacraments, right? That marriage is a sacrament, one of the sort of capital S sacraments, right? We know that, but it's a sacrament because it's sacramental, right? In other words, it's a visible sign of an invisible reality. So he says this again at the beginning of the text because this sets the tone for the rest of our conversation, specifically on contraception. How we understand contraception is dictated by how we understand the sexual act as unitive and procreative, and that has to be understood within what we were just talking about. What is marriage? Marriage is not just some sort of cultural institution, but it is a participation in the very life of God. So that first section then introduces the question of love, married love as a participation in the very life of God. But then he continues on shortly after. We're jumping to section 9 here, and he talks about married love. So when we talk about love between a husband and a wife, what does that mean in expansion of this idea of participating in the life of God? And as we've said before in this program, love is not a feeling or an emotion, though it may be accompanied by those. It's willing and seeking the good of the other for the sake of the other. But then, of course, we are called to love all people, including our enemies. So what is unique or special that constitutes married love? So let's read some of this here. In light of these facts, the characteristic features and exigencies, urgent need, of married love are clearly indicated, and it is the highest importance to evaluate them exactly. This love is above all fully human, a compound of sense and spirit. It is not then merely a question of natural instinct or emotional drive. It is also, and above all, an act of the free will, right? So number one, it's an act of the will. It's not a feeling or an emotion, whose trust is such that it is meant not only to survive the joys and sorrows of daily life, but also to grow, so that the husband and the wife may become, in a way, one heart and one soul, and together attain their human fulfillment. So number one, it's an act of the free will. Number two, it is a love which is total, that very special form of personal friendship in which husband and wife generously share everything, allowing no unreasonable expectations and thinking solely of their own convenience. Whoever really loves his partner loves not only for what he receives, but loves that partner for the partner's own sake, content to be able to enrich the other with the gift of himself. So again, we can love and should love our parents, we should love our children, we should love our friends, yes, we should love our neighbors and our enemies, but what we're seeing here that's starting to qualitatively differentiate this from those types of loves, this is a total love, which includes, of course, not just things like finances, husband and wife coming together and having a shared bank account, but sexuality, which of course is the focus of this text. Number three, married love is also faithful and exclusive of all other, and this until death. This is now husband and wife understood it on the day on which, fully aware of what they were doing, they freely vowed themselves to one another in marriage. Though this fidelity of husband and wife sometimes presents difficulties, no one has the right to assert that it is impossible. It is, on the contrary, always honorable and meritorious. The example of countless married couples proves not only that fidelity is in accord with the nature of marriage, but also that it is the source of profound and enduring happiness. So number three, faithful and exclusive. And then number four, the fourth point here, finally, love is fecund. It is not confined wholly to the loving interchange of husband and wife. It also contrives to go beyond this to bring new life into being. Marriage and conjugal love are by their nature ordained toward the procreation and education of children. Children are really the supreme gift of marriage and contribute in the highest degree of their parents' welfare. I think this one is the least appreciated and arguably the most important, right? That when you have a married couple, a husband and wife, often today in our culture, what do? They have conversations about, well, can we financially afford the children? How many children do we want, right? What is our ideal number of children? All of those sort of rational decisions. But what Paul VI wants to say here is not that rational decisions are bad, and we're going to talk about that later in this text, but that love is fundamentally fecund, right? Fecundity. Think of, rich soil that brings forth plants and flowers, etc., right? So that the very nature of love, of willing and seeking the good of the other for the sake of the other, that is faithful, that is exclusive, it's total, it is an act of the will, that love in its nature is to produce something outside of itself, right? So, I mean, just think about God, right? Why did God create? Well, if we say that God is love, and God doesn't need to create us. He doesn't need us to worship him. He doesn't need us to make sacrifices. He doesn't need anything. He's God. So therefore, why does God create at all? Well, on the one hand, we can't fully know the answer to that because the why question with God is always the most difficult. We can't read God's mind, of course. But if God is love, then that means it's in his very nature to be bountiful, to exude, to be fecund. So we shouldn't be surprised that God creates because it's in God's very nature to do so if God is love, right? Just think about the love of a parent, right? If you truly love your children, you're not threatened by them in any ways, even if they grow up and become more successful than you, more financially rich than you. All of those sort of markers of secular success, if you truly love your kids, that's not a threat to you. In fact, that's what you want because you're willing their good and you want them to not be homeless and drug addicts, right? You want them to do well. And so it's in the very nature of your love that you want them to have a flourishing, wonderful life. And so that's in the very nature of married love. So that if a couple come together and they get married out of love, out of a rightly ordered understanding, a good definition of love, then we should expect them to want as many kids as they can possibly have. So married love is a kind of subset of the Catholic Church's larger understanding of what love is. So we move now from talking about that married couple and the very nature of their love being fecund, to want to produce. It then does produce children. Then Paul VI moves on to talk about parenthood, and specifically responsible parenthood. And he gives sort of 4 points about what does responsible parenthood look like. So, married love, this is section 10. Married love, therefore, requires the husband and the wife the full awareness of their obligations in the matter of responsible parenthood, which today, rightly enough, is much insisted upon, but which at the same time should be rightly understood. Thus, we do well to consider responsible parenthood in the light of its very legitimate and interrelated aspects. With regard to number one, the biological processes, responsible parenthood means an awareness of and respect for their proper functions. In the procreative faculty, the human mind discerns biological laws that apply to the human person. So, the number one, parenthood, procreation is, among other things, a biological process. So understand it, be aware of it, respect it, and be in harmony with, be ordered with its proper functions. Number two, with regard to man's innate drives and emotions, responsible parenthood means that man's reason and will must exert control over them. And he's going to go on this later. But the idea, a lot of critics of a Catholic way of thinking about parenthood and procreation is that we're just slaves to our biology, that, if we get married at a really young age and we've got, 10, 15, 20 years of those procreative years, that we just have to have children. But notice that's not what Paul VI is saying, that we have reason and we do have a will and we must exert control over them, but in as he'll get into later, a correct way. With regard to physical, economic, psychological, and social conditions, responsible parenthood is exercised by those, number 3, who prudently and generously decide to have more children, and by those who, for serious reasons and with due respect to moral precepts, decide not to have additional children for either a certain or an indefinite period of time. So prudence, taking in the conversations of the virtues. So you have your will, you have your reason, you also have the virtues that you have. And so what this is saying is that just being biologically open to having as many possible kids as you possibly can have, and that could be 10 or more kids, might be fine for you and your spouse, but not necessarily. And so we don't have to just be, again, slaves to our biology. This is one of the criticisms people level against Catholicism. And when they do that, that just shows they don't know what the church teaches. That's just not what Paul VI teaches. Number 4, responsible parenthood, as we use the term here, has one further essential aspect of paramount importance. It concerns the objective moral order which was established by God and which a right conscience is the true interpreter. In a word, the exercise of responsible parenthood requires that husband and wife, keeping a right order of priorities, recognize their own duties towards God, themselves, their family, and human society. So this is kind of the flip side of the coin. So the first 3 talk about my will, my prudence, my reason, that my wife and I, or my husband and I, depending on your marriage situation, can and should come together and exercise those. At the same time, it's saying, okay, you as a husband and wife, keeping a right order of priorities, but you also have to recognize that you are not your own, right? As Paul says, St. Paul, that we are gifts given by God to ourselves, but not for ourselves, to be given away in love, that we have responsibilities, yes, we have duties to God and to our families and to society. So this is a caution against that sort of selfish attitude of, well, we'll have one kid or no kids because we also want to, fly off to Mexico twice a year to have these really expensive vacations, right? Nothing wrong with vacations, but when you prioritize your pleasure in vacation over your duties towards God, towards their family, towards human society, that's when you start to have a disorder, right? And so you're not becoming a responsible parenthood. You're becoming a selfish parent, frankly. And so we have to, yes, use our will, our reason, our virtues, our prudence, and understand our biology, but also at the same time, our duties towards God, towards family, towards human society. From this, it follows that they are not free to act as they choose in the service of transmitting life, as if it were wholly up to them, the parents, to decide what is the right course to follow. On the contrary, they are bound to ensure that what they do corresponds to the will of God, the Creator. The very nature of marriage and its use makes His will clear, while the constant teaching of the Church spells it out. So yes, we have a will. We can and should exercise that will, but we have to have our will in harmony with the will of the Creator. So what we have here is the classic both and, right? I'm sure you've heard this phrase that as in Catholicism, we are a both and people. God is one and Trinitarian. Jesus is fully human and fully divine. The church is a human institution and a divine institution. The Bible is a human document. It's a divine document. Once again, the both and. Yes, we have our will, our reason, our needs, our desires. And We have to be responsible. We have to correspond to the will of God, the Creator. So it's not an either or. It's not being a slave to our biology. It's also not exerting our will in a sort of dominant way. It's a both and, which, of course, ushers in the sort of question of discernment, right? That couples need to discern together the realities of their particular situation. Continuing on here, this is section 12. Notice we still haven't even gotten into contraception yet, because he's setting the stage, setting the table for us to understand contraception within this larger context. And here he wants to talk about marriage as unitive and procreative, which is not surprising to Catholics and probably even to non-Catholics to hear that. But I think this is fundamentally a prophetic critique of our culture and how it sees what marriage is about. In other classes I have, for example, had my students read the majority opinion of the U.S. Supreme Court 2015 text Obergefell v. Hodges. That's the Supreme Court that allowed federally, on the federal level, gay marriage. And I have them read that text, even though I'm not a lawyer and this is not a law class, and there is some sort of legal stuff towards the beginning. But what's sort of amazing about that text is if you read it, that text talks about marriage in I guess we could call it a sort of philosophical or theological lens. It's not really much of a law text, I don't think. It's predominantly, I'd say 75% of it is sort of a philosophical understanding of what marriage is, and it presents a very different vision of marriage compared to this thing that we're about to see here from Paul VI. In short, what Obergefell v. Hodges says is marriage is this sort of contract where two people come together for as long as they feel like it in order to sort of satisfy their needs, scratch whatever itches they have, not just sexually in a crude way, but that we all have, we can get lonely. The text specifically says that, right? And that's true. Human beings do get lonely, right? So in order to satisfy that sort of loneliness that we have, that we can sort of huddle together in the storm of life. Let's read this and see what Paul has to say about what marriage is fundamentally. So section 12. This particular doctrine, often expounded by the magisterium of the Church, is based on the inseparable connection established by God, which man on his own initiative may not break, between the unitive significance and the procreative significance, which are both inherent in the marriage act. So it's not one or the other that marriage, the marriage act, the sexual act, is a good thing when one or the other is present, but both at the same time. So let's keep reading. The reason is that the fundamental nature of the marriage act, again, that's a euphemism for the sexual act, right? The procreative act, the action, the sexual act of getting pregnant, while uniting husband and wife in the closest intimacy, also renders them capable of generating new life. And this is a result of laws written into the actual nature of man and of woman, right? So not a social construct or a bygone cultural creation, but it's in our nature. And if each of these essential qualities, the unitive and the procreative, is preserved, the use of marriage fully retains its sense of true mutual love and its ordination to the supreme responsibility of parenthood to which man is called. We believe that our contemporaries are particularly capable of seeing that this teaching is in harmony with human reason, right? So you don't even have to be Catholic to really understand this. You can just use reason. But note here this idea that that unity and procreation is good, right? When the sexual act is ordered towards unity and procreation, it's good. This is another critique of Catholicism, especially in this country, coming from our sort of puritanical background. This sort of often even gets criticized of Catholicism because the Puritans and Catholics were both Christians. And so the assumption is, well, Catholics think sex is bad, it's dirty. Well, no, as you can see here, Paul VI is saying that sex is not bad or dirty. Within it, when it's within that married love and ordered towards its proper end, unity and procreation, it is good. But those criteria have to be present. So he talks about love, he talks about marriage, he talks about parenthood, and now he talks about the sexual act, right? So as I was saying earlier, those different puzzle pieces, getting those into place so that now we can start to talk about contraception and birth control as the puzzle piece, and how does that fit or not fit into this larger puzzle so that it makes sense. The church's teaching on contraception makes sense. So now we're on section 13, and what we're going to see here is that the problem with contraception is not, as a lot of people, again, there's a lot of misconceptions here. And one of the misconceptions is people hear that phrase, artificial birth control, and then the other phrase you'll hear is natural family planning. And so a lot of people assume that the Catholic Church's problem with birth control, specifically the pill or even synthetically made condoms, is that it's not natural, that it's artificial. And so artificial bad, natural good, and that's not true. Those words can be misleading. If the Catholic Church were against the pill because it's an artificial, hormone or chemical that you take, well, then to be consistent, the Catholic Church would have to be against other artificial things like ibuprofen, right? That if you have a headache, the Catholic Church would have to say, well, I'm sorry, you can't take ibuprofen or some other pill like that because it's artificial and you can't do that. But as you know, the Catholic Church is perfectly fine with you taking headache medicine if that's what you need, or other types of drugs. So the problem has nothing to do with the fact that the pill is a pill or hormone or drugs or anything like that, or that it's artificial. So the obvious question then is, all right, what is the problem? What is wrong with it? So let's read this. This is section 13. Men rightly observe that a conjugal act imposed on one's partner without regard to his or her condition or personal reasonable wishes in the matter is no true act of love, and therefore offends the moral order in its particular application to the intimate relationship to husband and wife, right? And in fact, legally this used to be protected, right? So obviously, for example, rape is bad, but even legally speaking, in an earlier time, that there wasn't really an understanding that within marriage that there could be rape. I think we rightly have a better understanding of that now, because even within marriage that can be possible. So, and why is that problem? Why is that problematic? I mean, on the one hand, we just instinctively know that, but getting back to our previous definition, unitive and procreation, well, rape certainly can lead to procreation, and we've seen procreation is good, but rape offends against the first one, right? It's not unitive. That act of rape does not bring two people together. In fact, it damages that, not just the relationship, but it damages the person, right? So that's a problem when a sexual act, a conjugal act, is imposed on one's partner. So sort of setting an analogy here, Paul VI wants to do. Let's keep reading. If they further reflect, they must also recognize that an act of mutual love, so not an act of rape, which impairs the capacity to transmit life, which God the Creator through specific laws has built into, frustrates his design, which constitutes the norm of marriage, and contradicts the will of the author of life. Hence, to use this divine gift while depriving it, even if only partially, of its meaning and purpose, is equally repugnant to the nature of man and woman, and is consequently in opposition to the plan of God and his holy will. So, what's he getting at? So, rape is bad because it offends against the unitive aspect of the sexual act, even if it allows the procreative. Contraception kind of flips the coin. It's on the other side, right? That a husband and wife could have the sexual act, they're using contraception, and it is unitive, it's bringing them closer together, it's expressing those, all of those things that we can't put into words of love between a husband and a wife, but it offends against the second, it offends against the procreative, right? If you're on contraception, you're using it correctly, correctly in the sense of what the contraception is intended for, which is to prevent procreation, then you're offending against that second part. So the sexual act with contraception can be, at least theoretically, unitive, but it can't be procreative. So both rape and the sexual act within marriage using contraception, they're both bad, but kind of for the opposite reasons. One offends against the unitive aspect of the sexual act, and the other offends against the procreative act of the sexual act. One of the things in the moral life, and you talk about this in your moral theology class, is that there are some actions, moral actions, that are what are called intrinsically evil, right? In the very nature of doing the act, it's an evil act, even if you have good intention, right? Most moral acts don't fall into that category. Most acts fall into the category that certain other things are required to be understood whether or not the act is moral or not. So, for example, things like intention and context. If I'm dating a woman and we're dancing and I step on her foot and I break her toe, is that a morally bad act? Well, it depends on my intention. Am I just a bad dancer and I accidentally did it? If that's the case, then it's not a morally problematic action. However, maybe we got into a fight earlier in the day and I'm kind of angry at her and I wanted to punish her, so I slammed my foot down intending to break her toe. Obviously, that is a morally bad action. So intention, in most cases in the moral sphere, and other things like context, need to be considered. And what Paul the Sixth says here, and this is section 15, is the question of intention in this case also has to be considered, this case of contraception. So he says, on the other hand, the church does not consider at all illicit the use of those therapeutic means necessary to cure bodily diseases, even if a foreseeable impediment to procreation should result therefrom, provided such impediment is not directly intended for any motive whatsoever. So that could be, and I'm not a medical doctor and I'm not a woman, so I don't know these things in detail, but I've heard, for example, some women are on the pill, not because they're trying to prevent getting procreation, to prevent procreation, but for medical reasons, or, think of maybe you have a long line of your mother, your grandmother, your great-grandmother, they all died at the age of 40 because of cervical cancer or something like that. And so you have a medical procedure in your 30s because you're just trying to live. You don't want to die at the age of 40. And a procedure like that could prevent the woman from having children. That is acceptable because the intention is not to prevent children. The intention is to live past the age of 40, which is a good thing, and that the sort of secondary consequence is that the woman cannot have children. So I think this is important. Again, critics of this document often don't understand it, and they think, again, that it's just the Catholic Church is 100% against the pill or any other sort of therapeutic means, whereas the church is saying, no, you can and should use medicine if your intention is to cure bodily diseases, to extend life, etc. And if there are secondary consequences where procreation becomes either temporarily or permanently impossible, those are acceptable. You might, talk to your pastor, talk to a moral theologian. You may need to discern and consult and get the full information. What are the medical consequences? What are the medical procedures? But I wanted to make sure that we point that out. Paul VI doesn't really talk much about that. This is just sort of section 15 is the only place he talks about it, but it's important to know, right? And I think this is one example of many examples in this text and in the church's teachings in general of a sophistication, of a nuance, right? That the Catholic Church in her moral teachings and in all of her teachings does not operate with a sledgehammer, right? There's nuance, there's sophistication, there's depth, there's an understanding of possible exceptions or possible abnormal cases or something like that. So Paul VI wants to allow that sort of subtlety of nuance and understanding of it's not a hard no in all cases, that in some cases, depending on your intention, that the medical procedures might be necessary. So a moment ago we said that the problem with contraception is not that it's quote-unquote artificial, and that the good of quote-unquote natural family planning is that it's natural. But we do need to then explore this question of the term that's often thrown around today is natural family planning. So what is it? And why is it the sort of preferred method of the church? He doesn't get into the specific medical issues. Again, he's not a medical doctor. I'm not a medical doctor. And again, since 1968, things have gotten much more sophisticated in terms of our understanding of the human body and how these procedures should go. So consult other documents, other experts in other fields to get into a true deep understanding of the sort of biology of it. He says, section 16, if therefore there are well-grounded reasons for spacing births arising from the physical and psychological conditions of the husband and wife or from external circumstances, the church teaches that married people may then take advantage of their natural cycles imminent in the reproductive system and engage in marital intercourse only during those times that are infertile, thus controlling birth in a way which does not in the least offend the moral principles which we have just explained. So again, we saw earlier that the church says that you can and should use your reason and your will, and if there are times, and there are times, where the prudent thing to do is to not just sort of follow your biology, but to not have kids. If you're literally in the middle of a civil war right now, and there's civil wars going on or wars going on around the country, around the world, all the time, it makes sense that, and you're trying to flee to another country, to be a refugee, to get out of the physical danger of bombs falling on your head. You don't want to have an eight-month pregnant wife or trying to take that newborn baby 1,000 miles to get to another country, right? So there are legitimate reasons why you might want to space out your births. And again, the church is not saying be a slave to your biology. In those types of circumstances, take the opportunity to space those births. But again, this calls into things like discernment, not being a slave to your desires, like I want to have a fancy car, and so if I have a kid, then I have to go out and get a minivan, and I don't want a minivan, I want a sports car. So using your virtues, using your well-formed conscience to decide when is the right time to postpone having kids. And you need, again, consult with your pastor, your spiritual director, people that you find to be spiritually mature and can help you in those decisions. So it's a difficult dance, right? The moral life is difficult, and here's an example of that. Let's keep reading. Neither the church nor her doctrine is inconsistent when she considered it lawful for married people to take advantage of the infertile period, but condemns as always unlawful the use of means which directly prevent conception. Even with the reasons given for the latter practice may appear to be upright and serious. In reality, these two cases are completely different. In the former, the married couple rightly uses a faculty provided them by nature. In the latter, they obstruct the natural development of the generative process. It cannot be denied that in each case, the married couple, for acceptable reasons, are both perfectly clear in their intention to avoid children and wish to make sure that none will result. But it is equally true that it is exclusively in the former case that the husband and wife are ready to abstain from intercourse during the fertile period as often as for reasonable motives the birth of another child is not desirable. And when the infertile period recurs, they use their married intimacy to express their mutual love and safeguard their fidelity towards one another. In doing this, they certainly give proof to the true and authentic love. All right, so getting back to that point of intention, in one sense, in both cases, the intention is the same, right? Whether you use contraception or natural family planning, the intention is, for this moment in our lives, we intend not to have kids. So it may seem that because the intention is the same, that they're morally equivalent. But what he's saying in this section is, well, no, because the difference is there's also a way of going about it. And that way of going about abstaining from having kids is different. So in one way, a sort of image I like to use is, let's say you walk up to a door frame, right? And there's two possibilities. The door is either closed or it's open, right? When the door is closed, it is impossible for you to go through the door, through the doorway into the next room. The other case is, okay, the doorway is open, the door is not closed, but you are choosing to stand in the doorway. So in both cases, whether the door is closed or the door is open, you're standing in the doorway, you're not moving. But the difference is, the door, when it's closed, is impeding you. You can't get through that if you wanted to. You can't step through into the next room because there's this door in front of you. Whereas if the door is open, yes, you're choosing to stand in the doorway and not go into the next room, but there's still that possibility if you want to go into that next room, you can. So in other words, what the Catholic Church says is that the difference between using natural family planning and artificial contraception is that when you use natural family planning and you have the sexual act, you're still, even if you're in that sort of infertile time period throughout the month, you're still open to the possibility of procreation, right? Not that it's a miracle, but you know, people get it wrong, right? So maybe you mistrack your wife's, and you and your wife together, the woman's cycle, and so you think she's not fertile, but in this given moment, she actually is, and so you end up having a child, right? It wasn't your intention to do that, but you are being open to that possibility because even though you're intending not to have kids, you're not using birth control, and so you're open to the possibility. So that's really the difference there, but in this particular situation. Even though your intention in both cases, natural family planning, contraception, is not to have kids, that's the intention, but you're doing it in a different way. Natural family planning, you're still open to the possibility of procreation, open to the possibility that God is going to give you that gift of children. Whereas if you're using contraception, artificial contraception, you are in effect saying, we are not open to this. We're not open to this gift of God. And that's a fundamental and important difference there. And this is what, you know, I don't want to get into canon law, that's a whole other class, but the idea of when two people come together to get married, there are certain criteria that make that marriage valid. And one is that when you enter into that marriage, you both have to be open to the possibility of children. That doesn't mean you have children. That doesn't mean that you're physically, biologically even possible of having kids. But that your fundamental posture, your fundamental stance is, I am open to God giving me the gift of children if that's what he wants to do. And so if, again, that's one of the criteria to make a marriage valid. Here in this case, after the couple is married, they're having that sexual act. Again, even if they're choosing to have only sex within that window of infertility during the woman's cycle, they're still open to the possibility of having the children. And that intention is different from having to use birth control, in which you are in effect saying, we are not even open to the possibility. All right, I want to end here on section 17. This is my personal favorite part of the text, and I hinted at this earlier. So this is written in 1968, and Paul VI basically here in this section is saying, if we enter into sort of a contraceptive society, there's going to be some problems. It's not just preventing births, but it's going to cause a sort of fundamental earthquake in our society. He was making predictions in 1968. Well, we're in the 21st century. Decades have gone by, and we can sort of evaluate his predictions. Were his predictions right and were his predictions wrong? And his predictions are, again, grounded, not just sort of made up out of thin air, but grounded in the discussions that we've had about an understanding of marriage and love and parenthood and the sexual act and all of that. I think there's an intimate connection between his predictions and his understanding of the truths of those things that I just mentioned. So if he gets what I would say is, if he gets his predictions right, then that means his fundamental premises are right. If he gets his predictions wrong, well, maybe his fundamental premises are wrong. So let's read these 4 different predictions, and then in our discussions on Zoom, let's talk about them. Did he get it totally right? Did he get it partially right? Did he get it half right? Let's see. Let's talk about this. All right. So again, we're on section 17 here. Responsible men can become more deeply convicted of the truth of the doctrine laid down by the church on this issue if they reflect on the consequences of methods and plans for artificial birth control. Let them first consider how easily this course of action could open wide the way for, number 1, marital infidelity. Okay? Marital infidelity. So think back. He's making a prediction. He's saying that because of contraception, because of it does, not 100%, but it's pretty effective at stopping birth, that a husband can think to himself, oh, I've now got an opportunity to go have sex with somebody else, and there's not going to be evidence of it, right? So there's a better chance that I can get away with cheating on my wife, or the opposite, the wife cheating on the husband, because there isn't quite the same risk of getting pregnant by this other person as there is, prior to the contraceptive pill. So number 1, an increase of marital infidelity. There's going to be more cheating. And of course, what happens if there's more cheating? Well, if you find out, then that's going to increase divorce, right? If you do get caught, if the contraception fails, and of course that's not the only way to get caught. There's a million other ways of getting caught. Well, oftentimes if you have marital infidelity, it's going to lead to divorce. Number 2, and a general lowering of moral standards. Not much experience is needed to be fully aware of human weakness and to understand that human beings, and especially the young, who are so exposed to temptation, need incentives to keep the moral law. And it is an evil thing to make it easy for them to break that law. So just think, since 1960 or 1968 when he wrote this, in these decades, would you say that on a general sense, but even more specifically in the sexual realm, there's been a lowering of moral standards, right? When something, in this case, the pill, allows you to not have kids and do things like marital infidelity, does that make it easier to lower the moral standards? Let's talk about that. Another effect that gives cause for alarm is that a man who grows accustomed to the use of contraception may, number 3, forget the Reverend's due to a woman, and disregarding her physical emotional equilibrium, reduce her to a mere instrument for the satisfaction of his own desires. no longer considering her as his partner, whom he should surround with care and affection. So men, husbands, or even single men, what is contraception going to do? When we look at women, we don't think the object of my love, the mother of my children, my partner in this life. If I know that contraception, she's either using it or together we're using it in some way, pill or some other avenue, that this woman or this man becomes an object of sexual use, right? Because we are dividing out the sexual act from the procreative act. That's what contraception allows us to do. So if we no longer have the procreative act, all you have left is the sexual act, and it's, it feels good, it's pleasurable, and so then this woman or this man becomes an avenue, a vehicle for my pleasure, and that she then becomes the object of sexual use. So she's no longer created in the image and likeness of God, valuable, having an inherent dignity. She becomes a means for my sexual gratification, an object of use. So again, ask yourself, since 1960 or 1968, has Paul VI predicted that? Do we have in the last few decades an increase, especially among men, thinking that women are objects of sexual use for them rather than these wonderful creatures created in the image and likeness of God? Number 4, the fourth point. The fourth prediction. Finally, careful consideration should be given to the danger of this power passing into the hands of those public authorities who care little for the precepts of the moral law, who will blame a government which, in its attempt to resolve the problems affecting the entire country, resort to the same measures as are regarded by lawful by married people in the solution of a particular difficulty. Who will prevent public authorities from favoring those contraceptive methods which they consider more effective? Should they regard this as necessary, they may even impose their use on everyone. It could well happen, therefore, that when people, either individually or family or in social life, experience the inherent difficulties of the divine law and are determined to avoid them, they may give into the hands of public authorities the power to intervene in the most personal and intimate responsibility of husband and wife. I think some conspiracy theorists might say, oh, he's worried about the state, that the state's going to come in and control husband and wife's productive lives. And that this is sort of some cynical dystopian vision of just sort of being scared. Well, certainly we see this did happen without question and is continuing to happen in China, right? For decades, they had the one-child policy in China. They recently changed that, opened it up to be a little bit more permissive. But in China, that absolutely did happen, in addition to other instruments like abortion. And then, of course, what they didn't intend to happen is when you have things like ultrasounds, that when a woman gets pregnant, you can have an ultrasound, find out if it's a boy or a girl. And because of this one-child policy, and within China there is, and I'm not an expert at this, but a cultural favoring of boys over girls, that what ended up happening is that women would get pregnant, the child would be a girl, abortion would happen, and that this cycle would continue until maybe a husband and wife had a son. So the one-child policy was instituted, I believe, 1980. So now that happened for decades. And then what ended up happening is that all of those babies that were born that were men, they grew up, now they're in their 20s, 30s, or 40s. They want to have their own families, but there are a lot more men in China than girls in China. So in other words, there's not enough women to get married and have families. So you have all these social problems in China that have arisen because you have tens of millions of single men running around unable to get married, start their own families, have that stability that families and wives provide. So there's just an innumerable social problems there. Now, what about the U.S., right? I mean, on the one hand, it's certainly true we don't have a one-child policy or anything as severe as China. That's true. But let's talk in our Zoom discussion. Do we see in the decades after Humanae Vitae that the church, the state, as we hear it said here, that the state may impose their use, contraceptions, on everyone, and that public authorities the power to intervene in the most personal and intimate responsibility of husband and wife. What do we see in our country, the U.S. today, that did or did not come true from Paul VI's prediction? So let's talk about that.